The Donner Superman films brought with them so many feelings of childlike wonder and hope. They were the first time we truly believed a man could fly. So when Bryan Singer wanted to make a direct continuation from Donner's work, fans were ecstatic. We wouldn't need to suffer through another origin story and could pick up right where they left off with Superman 2. Sounds perfect. Today, we're seeing if that set unachievable expectations and flying up into the world of Superman Returns. The Superman property had been dead in the water since Superman 4: A Quest for Peace in 1987. But the 90s brought an interesting revival to the Superman character with the Death of Superman storyline in the comics, and with that brought renewed interest in the Man of Steel. Tim Burton, having been the man behind 1989's Batman, developed a new Superman film during this period. It was titled Superman Lives and would have featured Nicolas Cage as Kal-El. They even went as far as to have costume tests, but unfortunately the project was cancelled. But Warner Brothers knew they couldn't just leave one of their hottest properties on ice, so they started developing Superman Flyby and targeted a June 2006 release. Mick G, who had recently had success with the Charlie's Angels movies, signed on to direct a script from J.J. Abrams. While Abrams was not nearly to the level that he is now, he'd had tremendous success in television with Alias and the soon-to-be Lost. Mick G then lost interest in the project and dropped out. Still wanting to keep their 2006 release date, Warner then went to Bryan Singer about the project. Singer, having already successfully launched the X-Men into the Hollywood stratosphere, was a fan of the character and jumped at the opportunity. By doing so, he even had to drop out of X-Men: The Last Stand. With his X2 screenwriters Mike Dougherty and Dan Harris, they set out to develop their ideal Superman story. As a starting point, Singer had decided that the story would be a continuation of Donner's films, and be set 5 years after the events of Superman 2. Singer originally pitched his story to Richard Donner and his wife Lauren Schuler Donner, despite neither of them owning the rights to the character. But Singer felt that it was important to get Donner's approval on his story. Thankfully for him, Donner was very excited about his project and gave him the thumbs up. But then, the search moved towards finding their Man of Steel.
You wrote that the world doesn't need a savior, but every day I hear people crying for one.
Jim Caviezel, who had recently starred as Jesus in Passion of the Christ, expressed interest in the role, but was turned down for obvious reasons.
Nobody with the Jesus.
Brandon Routh was found in Los Angeles after a long search for unknown actors. While some actors were looked at, the producers felt that any known person just completely drew you out of the scene. In fact, Singer makes it sound like Routh had the role very early on. It was just about convincing Brandon that he was good enough for it. Funnily enough, this wouldn't even be the first time that Routh had auditioned for the role of Clark Kent, having also vied for it in the WB show Smallville. Jumping forward in history a bit, future Superman Henry Cavill had actually auditioned for the role in Superman Returns. So if you're trying to find out who's going to be the next Clark Kent, I'd suggest looking at who auditioned for Man of Steel. Daniel Cudmore, who had played Colossus in Singer's X2, also auditioned for the role. Given the connection to the Christopher Reeve version, Routh had some pretty big shoes to fill. Thankfully, he completely embodies the character, practically bringing Reeve back to life, especially with his Clark Kent performance. His awkwardness feels straight out of 78. Even Reeve's widow Dana felt Routh's resemblance to her late husband was uncanny.
Kitty, what did my father used to say to me?
You're losing your hair?
Before that.
Get out.
He said, you can print money, manufacture diamonds, and people are a dime a dozen, but they'll always need land.
With Gene Hackman having left such a heavy impression with his interpretation of the Lex Luthor character, and with the fact that this was technically supposed to be a continuation, Luthor needed to have the same gravitas. The only actor ever considered for the role was Kevin Spacey, as he had a close friendship with Singer since acting with him in The Usual Suspects. Spacey didn't really try to emulate Hackman and instead just plays a standard villain. He's hammy and loud, but before things went south for him, was one of the standouts of the movie.
Wrong!
Now though, it's a little awkward to see, not gonna lie.
Chief, I've done Superman. Covered him.
Spacey suggested to Singer that Kate Bosworth would be perfect for the role of Lois Lane, which he wholeheartedly agreed with. But the studio took some convincing. Claire Danes, Kerry Russell, and even Amy Adams had auditioned for the role of Lois. But ultimately, Singer was given his choice, and Bosworth was cast in the role. Given that she was the only actor in the cast to receive a Razzie nomination, you could say her performance didn't exactly win people over. Margot Kidder, she is not.
Lois, Pulitzer Prizes are like Academy Awards. Nobody remembers what you got one for. It's just that you got one.
Perry White, the head of the Daily Planet, was originally cast with Hugh Laurie. Unfortunately, or well, fortunately for him, Laurie had found massive success with his TV show House, so he was forced to drop out of the movie. Thankfully for us though, Frank Langella stepped into the role. Then, having worked with him on X2, Shawn Ashmore was offered the role of Jimmy Olsen. However, due to obligations with X-Men The Last Stand, was unable to accept. That part eventually went to Sam Huntington. Singer brought in yet another of his X-Men actors, James Marsden, for the role of Richard White, Lois's new love interest and the seeming father of Lois's son Jason. Jason was played by newcomer Tristan Lake LeBeau, and his secret becomes pretty evident right from the moment he's introduced in the story. I mean, is there anyone in the movie theater watching that didn't think that this kid was Superman's son?
I was gonna pretend the brakes were out. Pretend! Like we talked about. You didn't actually have to cut them!
Whether it's Otis or Lenny, the role of the main villain's sidekick is almost more memorable than the big bad. So Singer knew he needed someone even more memorable for the role of Kitty Kowalski. Thankfully, he only ever had one person in mind, Parker Posey, who was always an absolute standout in Christopher Guest's many movies. She's amazing here and completely commands the screen whenever she's around. It's hard to not absolutely love what she's doing here. Unlike the Donner films, Returns ended up being a co-production between Warner Brothers and Legendary Pictures, who were on the rise. Despite Superman being very Americana in its presentation, filming outside of the US continued to be a trend for the character, as Returns started production in Australia of all places. While there's plenty of CGI in the film, Singer opted for a ton of practical options, building 60 different sets throughout the Gold Coast. I've talked about how much Singer wanted to recapture the magic of Donner's films, but how exactly did he manage that story-wise? Well, the movie picks up 5 years after the end of Superman 2, and Supes has been missing that entire time. See, he's off to visit the remains of his home world of Krypton. But while he's gone, Lois Lane moves on and has a kid, and Lex Luthor gets out of prison because Superman didn't testify against him in court. Rough. Thankfully for this group of people on this plane though, Superman makes it back just in time to save them, and see what weird real estate plan Luthor is up to this time. Because it's always gotta be real estate with him. See, this time he's going to create a new landmass using kryptonite, which will flood existing cities, and make his new island a necessity. Superman defeats Lex and hurls the kryptonite landmass into outer space. It all feels straight out of a comic book. Amazingly, Singer was able to reach an agreement with the Brando estate in order to use unused footage from Superman 2 for the film. While obviously this footage would need to be cleaned up and altered in order to fit into their story, it meant that Singer had one of the biggest connections to the Donner films possible. It really seemed like everything was looking great for this movie. Heck, the credits are even the exact same, which brings a certain magic to the proceedings right from the jump. That classic John Williams score blasting out just washes over you with that wonderful Superman nostalgia. As much as Singer was trying to call back to the past, the actual production was quite futuristic with its filming. This film was actually shot on Panasonic Genesis cameras, which makes it one of the first superhero ventures filmed entirely on digital. It also means the movie has a bit of a waxy look. and at times feels like you're playing a video game versus watching a movie. Having worked with Singer several times in the past, John Ottman boarded the film as its composer. With John Williams being the reason he'd gotten into composing in the first place, Ottman jumped at the opportunity. He's able to provide something that could pass as a Williams score, even bringing back the iconic main title theme. Not only did he provide the score, but he was also one of the film's editors. Talk about pulling double duty. If you're more interested in the behind-the-scenes stories of Superman Returns, Singer himself produced a series of vlogs chronicling the creation of the film. It's a near day-to-day breakdown of the goings-on and is something any fan should seek out. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows though, because there are several awkward moments amongst the crew, the biggest offender being a prank that director of photography Newton Thomas Sigel had played on the production designer Guy Hendricks Diaz. It had been decided that the massive Daily Planet globe would be a CGI creation due to the impracticality of it. But Sigel and Singer decided to tell Guy that it was supposed to be partially built. It's an extremely uncomfortable moment, and it's hard not to feel sorry for Guy, who is constantly being bullied through the production. Maybe a bit unsurprisingly, this would be the last time that Guy and Singer worked together. Superman Returns released on June 26, 2006 in the United States and brought in $85.6 million during its 5-day run. Given the 100+ million we're used to seeing from superhero movies these days, it's no surprise that Warner Bros. Was extremely disappointed with this number. It ended its run at $391.1 million, which was well below the $500 million mark that Warner had been expecting. With marketing costs included, they had spent nearly $363 million on the project. For a blockbuster, these margins were just too tight. And it's not even like the film was poorly received, receiving a 74% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The critical consensus was that Bryan Singer's reverent and visually decadent adaptation gives the Man of Steel welcome emotional complexity. The result, a satisfying, stick-to-your-ribs adaptation. And like many comic book films at the time, Superman Returns was given a video game where you got to fly around as the Man of Steel, but it didn't fare very well. The Saturn Awards continued their love for the Superman property, awarding the film with 5 different awards, including Best Actor for Brandon Routh, Best Score for John Ottman, Best Screenplay for Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris, Best Director for Bryan Singer, and finally Best Fantasy Film for the movie itself. 4 months prior to the film's release, a sequel was announced with the entire creative team returning. In fact, Singer had even dropped out of his long-gestating Logan's Run remake in order to direct this sequel. Rumored villains were Brainiac and Bizarro, and the large floating landmass from the end of Returns would serve as a major plot point. Unfortunately, Warner Bros. Felt that while the film was well reviewed, it should have brought in more at the box office. Despite Routh still on contract for more films, they decided that they would instead reboot the character, wanting to do away with the world created by Richard Donner. However, a reboot didn't interest Singer, and he dropped out of the project to direct Jack the Giant Slayer. And the Superman character was left to be reinvented. While Brandon Routh didn't exactly explode onto the A-list, he has managed to be a regular supporting character in Hollywood.
Chicken isn't vegan?
He's appeared as Ray Palmer, otherwise known as the Atom, in the CW's Arrowverse, which even saw him returning to the role of Superman, albeit a much older version of the character. James Marsden has appeared as Cyclops in the X-Men series both before and since his turn here. Oh, and what have Kevin Spacey and Bryan Singer been up to? Oh dear God, well then, yeah, guess these aren't all happy endings. While Superman Returns may not have launched the new set of films that were hoped for, it did provide a somewhat satisfying conclusion to Donner's Superman. While the pacing can certainly be criticized, the filmmaker's love for the character is ever present. We're getting away from the tall skyscrapers of Metropolis and into the world of anti-heroes. But that's a story for next time. Join us! Same movie time, same movie channel.